We fear this. We fear that they have something out that majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı, ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. Get a lot of killers. Why you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone sicks me on. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Hello and welcome to Nailing It Down, and today I have a little bit of wisdom to give you in regards to intellectual self-defense, abstractions, extensions, and the use of concepts to neutralize and confuse you. We're going to start off with the idea of an extension or an abstraction. Philosophy, in general, begins with abstraction. In fact, in some ways, if you read Plato, Plato sets out to do a classical dialectic to figure out the meaning of the concepts that don't seem to have concrete meaning in his society. Each of the Platonic dialogues often deals with one of these, both in an esoteric and exoteric way. Now, my job is not to get into the esoteric ideas in Plato, although this is some heavy debated and it's recorded in antiquity. Nor is my job to do intellectual history for you, but it is good to understand that what Plato was up to was using geometric logic to figure out what things could mean, and to do so in the context of debate because the definitions were unsettled. And so in geometric logic, you get a theory of the forms. Now, in Plato's dialogue and the Parmenides, he actually undermines this theory. But this theory comes out of the idea that there's a form of a circle. That's how we know what a circle is. There's a form of a can. That's how we know what a can is. This is kind of a correspondence theory of language where we uncover the world because the concepts are real. And they are real in a reality beyond the material world because of geometric and probably some mystical assumptions. All right. When I make the joke and calling a friend of Platonists rich, it is because they are taking abstractions, extensions of things without qualia, without qualities, without differentiating qualities, i.e. numbers, right? Which are something that we don't encounter in the world, but we deduce from things we do encounter in the world and assume that they have a reality. Now, we can get into the semantic definition of reality is where this normally goes. But why are we starting here? Well, some of these concepts need dialectical clarification because they become non-cognitive. All right. Take the three primary values of early modern liberalism: liberty, equality, fraternity. Liberty, equality, fraternity, or sometimes to degender fraternity, we say solidarity. What do all those mean? Well, in some vague sense, in the immediate sense, we think we know. Freedom is the freedom of autonomy. But then autonomy to do what and how? And freedom from what? And freedom from how? And freedom from whom? Isaiah Berlin used to say, freedom for wolves is death to the sheep. In other words, freedom is something as an abstraction that we know in a specific context, but trying to deduce what the essential essence of freedom is, we're left with only a few vague guidelines. Now, people can use this seeming non-cognitive nature of the extension of the concept to confuse us. I'll give you another example from anthropology, and this is from Marshall Sahlins, What is Kinship and What It Isn't. Human community, according to Sahlins, and according to a lot of anthropologists actually, is based on the symbolic extension of biological community, meaning our tribes are the people we get along with and treat as family, and this shows up in our metaphors for language, etc. We treat them as family because our survival and the survival of our progeny is dependent on it. But we don't actually need, and nor do we even necessarily understand, our genetic similarity as to why we would treat someone like that as family. This extension is natural and understandable. And we see it today with adopted parents, the chosen families, etc. That goes all the way back to deepest history for at least 40,000 years. And in all likelihood, given what we can learn from immediate return subsistence hunter-gatherer societies, probably the hundreds of thousands of years prior, when humans were not just Homo sapiens. See, the symbolic extension is something we even see in other mammals and mammal bands. Yes, there's a primacy of the immediate genetic relation, but all bands get over this. If they didn't, they would genetically degenerate. All right. This is the kind of extension where we extend something that is real, although even describing it requires an abstraction, into something that is imagined or symbolic. Well, you can see how this can expand out. Tribe to polis, polis to kingdom, kingdom to nation. Are to religious groups is actually the way it went in. The word ethnoi, for example, meaning people, what we use for what's the root of our English word ethnic. All right. In Greek, if you read the Greek Bible, they refer to the Christian ethnoi as a Catholic ethnoi, a universal ethnoi, a universal ethnic group to which we can all belong. All right. Now, originally, this has liberatory ideas in it that we all, the division between Roman and Jew and Sumerian is irrelevant because we can all belong. All right. Now, these prior tribes sometimes were biological, and some very early religions that still existed, you can't convert to them. And then some of them had open conversion. And many of these ancient religions went back and forth. Right? And in many ways, even calling them a religion is misleading because that word has Christian connotations. But let's not use that to say that religion is non-cognitive. We have a base idea of what it means in specific. Now, non-cognitivity comes out of moral philosophy. It is the idea that ethical sentences do not express propositions that can be true or false. All right. Moral, to put it the way a non-cognitivist like, Bernard Rosen and Richard Garner might put it, moral judgments are capable of being objectively true because they describe some feature of the world. Is a cognitive view. The non-cognitive view is the opposite of that. That a moral judgment is like an aesthetic thing, that it is a neutral value and has no cognitive true function. Now, this was taken to talk about God. There's a position that's not popular called agnosticism, which says the idea of God is non-cognitive because the concepts associated with God literally contradict each other. We know this going all the way back to Plato. So, example, can God create a rock that he cannot lift? Well, that's a word game, right? That's how people get out of that. But conceptually, it does mean that omnipotence and coherence as concepts bump up into each other. Now, what does this have to do with intellectual self-defense? Well, freedom, liberty, equality are all words that are abstract extensions. Now, they're not real abstractions, and I'll get to that at the very end, but they're extensions of concepts of which we know in a relative case, but when we try to figure out what their essence is, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot we can talk about. For example, when we talk about left and right, people will say, well, you just accept bourgeois economies. And I'm like, well, left and right are about relations to power distribution in most conceptions of left and right. Now, the actual historical conception of left and right does have its historical origins as words and the way we talk about words from the French Revolution. All right. So we already have to have a historically nominalist point of view about what left and right mean. They're relative, they came up in a specific time period. But the temperaments that underline them, you find occurring in societies going all the way back to what we have writing for. Prior to modernity, whatever that means, we have other ways of describing these kinds of tendencies because the content of them are so different than ours, but the temperamental inclinations are the same. Now, when we talk about left and right in terms of Marxism, we're actually talking about something very different, right? And this is where a lot of people on the internet right now use words to confuse you. They talk about materialism, but then use incoherent concepts, things that are non-cognitive. Take PMC, professional managerial class. Now, I can go into the origins of PMC with the Ehrenreichs, John and Barbara, trying to reconcile theories of Fordism from the 50s and how it was changing in the 70s. There were other theories about this as well. Christopher Lasch writes about some of them in his discussion of new theories of class that were emerging in the 60s about university students who had priorly actually come from the working class en masse, and because of the GI Bill, have been put into an institution that was essentially medieval and bureaucratic in its functions. The institution, however, became essential to capitalism as a way to off-sort training of workers. So how do you handle that? Well, there's this idea in James Burnham of the managerial classes because capital have been abstractified. And following the logic actually of Nikolai Bukharin, that first capital had been abstractified into joint stock companies, and then capital had been abstractified into national capital. Well, in the 50s, national capitalism no longer seemed to be the big deal, and maybe it had been abstractified into international capital managed by state capital firms. And so were we even talking about capitalism anymore? So they came up with theories of class to adjust to this. There is the Burnham managerial theory, which there are different sectors of management. Burnham favored the military sector of management as a sector of society that we should go to. Following off the ideas of Robert Michel and Pareto, Burnham in the new Machiavellians and in the Managerial Revolution argues that managerial societies now are just the way things are going to have to be. We're not going to get rid of them. So you pick the managers you think will be most efficient for your society. Burnham favored the military. And he went back and he read this all the way back in history that like most ideological debates were the debates between idealist forms of management and realist forms of management. Now, Burnham's predictions of America that he made at the end of the Modern Machiavellians were wrong, and Paul Maddox Sr. points this out in a review of the book, as does George Orwell. George Orwell is less attractive. I've linked those before, but I can put that in there. There's also Frederick Pollock's idea coming out of the Soviet Union that we lived in an administrative state and that we had an administrative class. And that somehow we have moved from some periodization where classical labor theory of value had applied and something like marginalism was now true. And there's a lot of Marxists who will talk about being like true Marxists who have typologies, abstract typology, like liberalism leads to communism, etc., that actually kind of believe this or at least toy with it. And a lot of the way we talk about these things now, PMC, come out of this. Now, these are fundamentally different assumptions from Marx's assumptions, and in fact, they are a completely different factor in which deciding what class is. While Marx does think class is power relations in societies and in capital, but in societies prior to capital, he also points out that the distinction between religious, political, and economic functionaries is almost unique to capitalist modes of production. Whether it's an illusion or not, and it is an illusion, actually, that is the way people experience the world, it's the way it is described to them, whereas the filial extensions and vow relations of most forms of managerialism or feudalism require you to recognize that your economic and political world are the same. So what does this have to do with the symbolic extension stuff? Are real abstractions? We haven't got there. Well, some people might tell you that these extensions are real extensions. Symbolic kinship creates communities, creates things like the ideas of nation eventually, as the concept gets further and further extended. Also, as it gets further and further extended, like eventually to race, it becomes almost non-cognitive. You don't think about what the traits are that distinguishes one race from another. For example, I was like, oh, well, people can't tell the difference. It's racist that people can't tell the difference between, say, North Africans and Latinos. Well, I hate to tell you, but when I lived there, neither could they. The morphological traits are awfully similar. It's a highly mixed people, whatever that means, right? Meaning that you, like in Egypt, for example, the range of skin tones and things that you would consider Egyptian, it's very large. I can pass as an Egyptian and was often mistaken for one. In fact, I was told when I was heavier that I looked like a famous Egyptian actor, despite the fact that I have very pale skin. Now, what does this tell you about our concept of race? Well, not a lot, all right? But it does tell you that the essential traits that we think make us this thing are traits that we are trained to look for. And everyone is trained for them. But the idea that you can't change that is actually also just false. All right. There's no essential difference there. And this brings the stuff to Arnold Schroeder talks about different ethnic groups and essential versus unessential differences in epistemic humility, blah, 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 blah. But the reason why I bring this up is because, symbolic kinship gets extended all the way out to biological race. The idea is all people who share a couple of morphological traits, and usually it's just skin tone, are somehow family, while other groups are not, are too just distantly related to be fully considered family and is fully considered human, is the max extension we've found so far, except when we try to expand the idea of family to all humans. Now, that tension is interesting, right? The tension is an extension of a symbolic idea that we use to form effective communities. It's one of the social technologies we use to survive, and yet it can also be used in ways and extended in ways that is not optimal for survival, optimal for all kinds of power relations, enable settler societies, etc. And we don't think about it because the extension, the metaphor, has become non-cognitive. Now, what's a real abstraction? Real abstraction is different. A real abstraction is abstract exchanges in commodity form, according to the French philosophers Alfred von Rittel, in which symbolic exchanges like money has value because it is symbolic of something and it serves three functions. Those functions have material correlates, but instead of just being, something that we just do in our head, we need a material stand-in for it, so it becomes real. All right. Now that's different than extension. But all these things can become non-cognitive. All right. Money's power and how it can be used to hide power relations is because we essentially don't think about what it is. And if we did, it would become harder and harder to have any hold on us. And if we stop believing in it, money just kind of stops working, even government money. But we're not going to stop believing it because we have no material. Our reality is structured. Our social reproduction is structured in such a way that this symbolic exchange is part of reality, and it is manifested in things which are real. So we call that a real abstraction. Now, it's a much more complicated theory than that. I'm going to link an article in the show notes about that. But all these things have to do with non-cognitivists. So let me get back to the PMC question. So the PMC question is a question of your function of power relations, right? Well, the power relations between professionals and managers are actually different. But we link them together because they have certain kinds of credentialing. So what becomes the definitional part of the class? Now, when I say I know PMC when I see it, even though I don't think PMC is a coherent category, what most people mean by PMC is stuff from upper middle class people, from the habitus of an upper middle class background, from a habitus of relative wealth, but not on top of wealth, where social competition is super high because people are fighting for a chance to actually become elites, even though they are just outside of it, but they are comfortable in a way that poor people are not. And thus there's all kinds of different social codes that emerge from this. But you actually study like professions, managers, and things in different areas, it doesn't actually line up to what we say is professional managerial culture, right? That's specific to urban, fairly liberal elites. And we can't even really define what liberal is. Ask any Marxist, and it's a word that we can project any number of things upon. And in fact, even from non-Marxist, it works as a social category because it is vaguely non-cognitive. We know that to be liberal is to have certain kinds of values that align with the market, but not certain other kinds of values that align with more traditional notions of this, that, and the other. But we don't really know what any of that means anymore. Everyone can accuse every liberal of being illiberal in some way, because if you find any prior definition, it becomes very hard to hold any modern definition to it, which is always why I'm saying we have to have relative and nominal definitions, but we need to know the historical origins of these words to understand how they changed. And this is the other reason why I say we have to be careful. We talked about class. I did a theorizing with a hammer on nominal definitions of class, and in accepting that different definitions of class may describe real things and may be mutually incompatible. It doesn't mean they're not real. The problem with a concept like PMC is that it says it's describing one thing, it's actually describing another. Now, what I've discovered in the way PMC is used, often by people who don't understand Marxist categories, is to claim that people who try to clarify things or use things that are not, basically people's favorite authors are PMC. Now, as a background, yes, I'm educated, but I come from a different world than upper middle class world. And I've made this abundantly clear. All right. So a lot of people who say they're not PMC, but have jobs that would fall into that structure, all right, will do this based on their habitus, but then when they meet someone who they dislike, they'll ignore that. They're making the concept non-cognitive so that it can be used as a social function without having cognitive content. This is used to confuse you. It's a rhetorical trick. One that, for whatever reason, humans do in multiple societies or social technologies, and I use that advisedly here, because there are ways in which we alter our biological limitations by linguistic and social extension. Right? We do this conceptually. Our frontal lobes are literally developed for it. It is related to our biological being. And yet, it can be used to fool us. The symbolic expansion is also related to things like spectacle, or feeling the need to take part in the social adjudication of some abstract event in which you have little control, power, and in which even your opinion doesn't seem to matter much, except that it might hurt people who are involved. Non-cognitive ideas are rampant, and there's nothing inherently wrong with them. Often abstraction and extension is fine. Again, but you should make sure that you can figure out in context what those things mean. And if people start blending context where they're using things like PMC, but also insisting on a true Marxism, even though none of that is inherent in Marxist works, or even in Marxism as a thought corpus from, either Kautsky or Lukács, the two kind of codifiers of Marxism, one as tactics, other as philosophy or methodology. Both of whom I have problems with, actually, but that's another video. You have to go, well, why are they doing this? Well, in some ways, I think, people like Catherine Liu are trying to describe something that they see, and they're using terms invented by, and they're using it differently, actually, but terms invented by the Ehrenreichs to deal with a time period where the actual economic situation was different, and thus our understanding of an economic situation was different. The post-war boom in America, it's very specific in what it does, and there are other theorists. Most of them have either politically neutral or right-wing associations. Michael Lynn being a corporatist or integralist version of this. Peter Turchin uses this as an analytic, and I'll link some of those people's books, and I'll list some of those people's books for you too in the show notes. You see here, though, that the most popular form on the internet is the least clear form because it's socially useful, because it is non-cognitive, because it can mean anyone with an education, but it can also mean a very specific, group of people, the way Adolf Reed defines PMC, with a fiduciary responsibility, who may be employees or may be petit bourgeois and have a high income. That's a very specific group of people. It's probably like 5% of the population, whereas the other more broad metaphorical terms, like anyone with a degree who thus has some kind of credential access to the economy, is more like 40% of the population. And if you look at people under 40, it's like 60% of the population have some form of this, if you count an associate's degree or a certificate. All right. Meaning that it's not really explanatory for what people are trying to explain it, because 60% of the population are not obnoxious progressives who are lording things over you. This is non-cognitivity. This is a rhetorical trick. You need to nail it down. Now, we'll come back to real extension later. My next one of these will be on the Anti-Imperial League, because I'm promising it for forever. But this is kind of a polemic against a lot of what I see on the internet right now. And it applies to everything from foreign policy to people being assholes in Twitter comments. Use it wisely.